Chapter 15 Hunt Club 56, Pig Farming, Kent Stewart. All those in the hunt gang were really disgusted with our many hunting arrangements we had made up to and including Eau Claire's in 55. We're convinced there had to be a better way. I called a meeting of all those who were interested and had hunted with us on one or more trips. The meeting was held at this house early in February, and it took a great deal of discussion to conclude that we should form a club. The charter members were Elmer Wilson, Alan Lee, Frank Lee, Ellis Corman, Dick Henderson, Ira Lee, Ralph Hill, Bing Harris, George Haw, John Rogers, Murray Burnham, and myself. I was elected president, Bing secretary, and Ellis treasurer. Elmer named the club Done Workin', and for the first few years any other name would have been more appropriate. Frank Lee, John Rogers, and myself made a trip to Parry Sound area to investigate 2 or 3 prospective locations on which to build a camp. We ended up talking to Jarvis Gregor, affectionately known as Jarv, the owner of Lost Channel Inn located 14 miles east of No. 69 Highway, about halfway between Parry Sound and Sudbury, near Paisley. When we explained our intentions, we were genuinely welcomed to pick a place not too far from him. He very highly recommended one particular spot which he said was located about 4 miles in the southeasterly direction on the old Mowat Trail. This trail was used extensively in the pioneer days when logging was done exclusively with horses, being the only connection between the settlement of the Mowat and others, including Lost Channel. We were assured there was an adequate supply of fresh water, as the early travelers had used a well located there to ice the trail for winter use. This was the most predominant reason another hunt gang from Stony Creek had built a shack there some 20 years ago. Their hunting score had been fantastic. Some years they had a full count, shooting only bucks. It was called the Brush Shack. We decided to investigate what seemed to be a hunter's paradise, and the 3 of us set out first thing the next morning with a few sandwiches and a compass each. Our instructions from Jarv were to follow the blazes that marked the Mowat Trail until we arrived at the bush shack. The first 2 miles had blazes that had been freshened and were easily followed, but from there on, most of those that were still there had almost grown over. They were hard to see and, in some cases, far apart because undoubtedly some of the original trees had either died or been removed by loggers. Well, anyway, we wandered around the bush all day, got trapped behind a body of water, and were lucky to get back out the same day. We never did find the brush shack that day. When we reported back home to the Done Workin' Hut Club, they were all in favor of settling in at the brush shack, but how the heck to find it? John and I made another trip up, and with more explicit instructions from Jarv, we again set out. We were in the brush no longer than an hour when it started to rain, and we were soaked from head to toe in no time at all, lost the trail, wandered around, and returned to Jarv's like a pair of drowned rats. Remember now, we were about 265 miles from home, and it did not seem like a good idea to report another failure to the gang. Jarv introduced us to a local sawmill owner, Victor Roy. He had a fair amount of the rough lumber we required to build our camp, and we finally talked him into delivering what we ordered right out to the brush shack for what we considered a very reasonable price. 1,530 feet of lumber cost $117.70. What a sneaky way to find your own camp. We anticipated bringing all the dressed lumber, plywood, roofing, doors, windows, stove, and equipment from home, so we also made arrangements for a team and wagon to meet us Saturday morning before the hunt season in November. Enthusiasm ran high for the rest of the summer, and we bought everything we needed, including black tar 10-test siding, $175 Davy lumber. All in all, we had a big truckload with everything like groceries, cooking equipment, tools, and clothing were included. 4 of the club members, each for reasons of his own, were unable to make the trip, which left 8 of us to go: Elmer, Frank, Ellis, Murray, John, George, Bing, and myself. We arrived in Lost Channel in good time Saturday morning, and wonders will never cease, Victor Roy had already delivered our lumber to the spot. John, Ellis, and Murray took what carpenter's tools they could easily carry and headed out for our new camp, while the rest of us remained to transfer the load from the truck to the wagon. On the Mowat Trail there were a few hills which were steep and muddy. A few times we each had doubts that we were doing the right thing by moving that far from civilization. Those who told us it was 4 miles must have measured as the crow flies, because there seemed to be no end to the bends and curves. I still think 5 miles is a closer guess. On discussing this trip with John, he convinced me that Victor Roy had supplied us with a small 2-cylinder John Deere Caterpillar tractor and driver, rather than a team of horses. Cost $60. The load was much too great for the condition of the road and the amount of power the little tractor could deliver, so we were stuck many times, and it was a time-consuming job getting through some of those mud holes. When we were more than halfway to camp, we finally hit a mud hole that stopped us solid. No amount of talking could convince the driver that we could ever get out of there that day, so he left us flat so that he could attend the Saturday night dance with his girlfriend. What a mess. The 3 guys in camp, having finished the job of placing the logs with the floor joists on top, decided to walk back out to see why we were delayed. They arrived at our scene shortly after the driver had left us. Boy, were they welcomed. John and Ellis said the road ahead was in worse condition and impossible with that kind of load. We unloaded about half of the weight by the side of the trail, and with John's first experience at driving this type of tractor, we continued on towards camp. Things went much better. We arrived at our new camp shortly after 2:00 p.m. to find that John, Murray, and Ellis had already picked our location some 50 yards from the ruins of the old brush shack, on ground that was much higher. The building was to be 18 feet by 28 feet, and 3 men already had the floor joists placed on 3 logs that ran the long way of the building. Victor Roy had unloaded all the lumber right beside the old ruins, so they had some job carrying each piece up a steep hill the full 50 yards. By the time we unloaded the wagon and arranged a makeshift shelter with a tarpaulin and a few 2x4s, we were all starved, so Murray heated a few cans of beans on a bonfire. Just at dusk, John and 2 others headed back out to pick up the other half of the load, while the rest stayed to build our overnight shelter. It must have been close to 8:30 before we could turn in, and having missed a complete night's sleep, nobody complained about a second-rate shelter. The temperature fell to a few degrees above freezing during the night, along with 2 inches of wet, slushy snow. Our temporary shelter was not built to accommodate this type of weather, and the weight of water and snow had formed pockets in various places of the roof, each holding up to a quart of water. About an hour before daybreak, one of those pockets suddenly broke loose and dumped its full contents right on John's face. Momentarily, he thought someone in the group was trying to be smart. He sat up quickly with a loud yell and a few choice words, fully prepared to do battle, but when he noticed everyone was waking, he could do no more than start the day on a hilarious note. We were lucky the day got a little warmer as noon approached, because for a while everything you touched was wet and cold. It took a very short time to complete the flooring, and as both John and Murray were qualified carpenters, they planned and built the wall studding and coached the others at the same time. Ellis undertook the job of hauling the remainder of the rough lumber up the hill by himself, and I doubt if he had stopped walking up and down that hill the whole day. His rubber boots had rubbed both legs raw at the top of each boot, and he had sore calves for 2 days after, but it did not prevent him from keeping us well supplied with the lumber we needed. Elmer Wilson was the oldest man in the group and had agreed that he should remain at Jarvis until Monday, because he figured the only contribution he could make to the building was his ability to cook for others. He was a notoriously poor walker, having spent his entire life behind a desk as an accountant. His physical condition was not that good either. I'll never know what prompted him to change his mind and head out towards our camp early Sunday morning. To make matters worse, he took the wrong direction at the fork in the trail, an easy mistake, walked to the winter camp and back to the fork, which added an additional 2 miles to the difficult 4. When Elmer stumbled into camp at 2:00 p.m., he was in a pathetic condition. He was completely exhausted, soaking wet, having fallen a few times, shaking with the cold, pale, and looked to be in a state of collapse. The building had progressed to the point where he had begun to put the roof joists in position, but with open studding and no roof, there was no place available to get him warm again. Everybody helped to put the siding on one corner, lay a few 4x8 sheets above, and enclose the remaining 2 sides of a very small room with the tarpaulin. A box to sit on, a shot of whiskey, and a Coleman camp stove brought him back to life in about an hour. We could all see the seriousness of the situation, and it spurred us to even greater efforts. After all the roof joists were placed, John undertook to saw the sheeting boards, rough lumber of random widths and lengths, with an ordinary handsaw. It took 3 of us nailing them down to keep up. I thought I was pretty good with a hammer, but at one point he was 3 boards ahead of me and laughing like crazy. As darkness was closing in, we had finished the siding, put in the windows and doors, installed both stoves, wood for heating, propane for cooking, moved in all the groceries and personal equipment, and built bunks to sleep. After a greatly appreciated meal, we put the last 2 strips of rolled roofing on the peak by the light of the Coleman lantern. We were thankful to have a roof over our heads again, and nobody had trouble getting to sleep. The next day, Monday, we put the aluminum siding on top of the tent test, adding a few finishing touches inside, and were ready to go hunting. It was a palace compared to the camps of previous years. The first few hunting days were something else. We had no knowledge of our area, not even a map. The only recognizable landmarks were the Blaze Mowat Trail up to our camp and the camp itself, which was in the middle of nowhere. We fastened the blazes on an old footpath the brush shack men had used, which ran directly south, and also those on the Mowat Trail leading farther southeast, but every scene we encountered was new. The conflicting reports of each man as he returned to camp about the location of each surrounding landmark only served to add to the confusion. 5 o'clock and darkness came, and John was the only man still out. When we fired a gun outside the door, we received a prompt answer, which seemed to come from a northwesterly direction, and no more than a half-mile away. 3 men put on clothes and with flashlights in hand headed out to the Mowat Trail towards Jarves. It was interesting to hear shots and answers getting closer together as time passed. When they found John, he was no more than 50 yards off of the Mowat Trail, preparing himself for a night in the bush. He had passed by our camp within 50 yards about 4 o'clock p.m. without seeing anything that looked familiar. Bet your bottom dollar we were all happy to see him in camp. The amount of game in that area was fantastic. Imagine hunting where nature has been virtually undisturbed for almost a quarter century. The first snowfall disclosed the whole picture. It was impossible to follow any one set of tracks for more than 25 yards without crossing another set, just as fresh. Besides deer, there were moose, porcupine, bear, fox, partridge galore, and at night we learned there was a wolf pack. There is something about hearing their howls in the middle of the night that makes you feel more content to be sitting in camp rather than somewhere out there, whether you consider them dangerous or not. Ellis returned to camp one afternoon just bubbling with excitement, and as everyone else had refused to leave the camp because of the heavy snowstorm, he had a very attentive audience to hear his story. As he stood under the overhanging branches of a large evergreen tree to get temporary protection from the falling snow, he saw the white tail of a deer flip into view and then disappear. It seemed to him to be no higher than a foot or 2 above the ground level, and as he stood motionless trying to believe his own eyes, he saw another, and another, and another. Just tails, no bodies, for a total of 7. When it was all over, he walked closer to investigate what proved to be easily explained. All 7 deer, there were tracks in every direction to prove it, had passed through a shallow valley just deep enough from Ellis's viewpoint to conceal them as they passed him. What he had seen was that part of each deer which came above the rim of the valley with every bound, a rather hopeless target. The score for that year was not great due to the fact that we had spent most of our time trying to find camp, and I doubt if anyone ventured further than a half a mile. Everyone had a good time, and we were convinced that we had hit the jackpot for location and camp qualities. A few final words about raising pigs. As I gradually became better established with the dairy and the ice cream cone manufacturer, my supplies increased in volume. This in turn prompted me to take advantage of the cheaper feed by using all the barn space to accommodate feeder hogs in place of sows. Undoubtedly, sows returned greater profits per dollar invested, but as more dollars were available, it seemed logical to consider the yearly net profits. It was a reluctant step because I enjoyed dealing with the individual sow, and the little pigs raised in our barn seemed to grow faster with less disease troubles. The day I sold Rusty, the Tamworth boar which I had raised from his birth, marked the beginning of the change of policy. It sounds silly to get sentimental over an ordinary pig, but I'm not so sure Rusty was that ordinary. We treated him very special right from the time I decided he was to be the head man of the barn. A mature boar can be as vicious as any wild animal, and any rough or harsh treatment is really never forgotten. Add to this the fact that their temperament changes are unpredictable. It makes good sense to treat him as gently as possible without ever relaxing total vigilance. The extra care must have paid off. Rusty never lost his good nature, his docile, cooperative manner, and I could easily guide him to any pen simply by walking beside him with a corn broom in hand to hold on one side of his head or the other to indicate direction. Flo could ride him as one would ride a horse, even in the outside hog run where we kept him with all the pregnant sows. However, when he grew to become almost 500 pounds, even a playful mistake could be too dangerous to allow her to have that fun. Bern Vanderkock was with me at this time, and it was his suggestion that we try to make him as a breeder before he had really reached maturity. He weighed slightly over 100 pounds, and I considered him too young, but Bern said, "Perhaps he doesn't think so." The sow to be bred was about 4 times his size and weight, and they looked rather ridiculous together. Nature told him that he had a duty to perform, but he seemed to have trouble trying to figure out exactly what duty. He made several fast trips around the sow before he stopped beside her, his head beside hers, and let one exceptionally loud woof that could be heard all over the barn. He then went to her other side and repeated the same performance. Bern and I leaned on the top of the pen partition to watch, almost hysterical with laughter, as Rusty seemed to glance up at us each time he passed, as if to say, "What the heck is so doggone funny?" The sow stood in the center of the small pen like a marble statue, and we decided to get him out before she became hostile. By the time his next turn came, Nature had completed his education, and he lived to sire many good litters of fine young pigs. As I have mentioned, we kept him in a pen that had access to the outside yard with the pregnant sows, principally because we had no small pen available. This gave him command of the feed trough also, and there was none who doubted his authority. Consequently, he grew to an enormous size. I took him to the auction sale in Ancaster, owned and operated by Gordon Shaw. We arrived early for the sale, and his appearance caused quite a commotion among those present, because he was the biggest thing that they had hit the sales in many a day. Gord guessed his weight to be over 900 pounds, and that started a great amount of debate, and finally the betting began. Gord covered all bets at even money, and it got to be a good sum. To prove his weight was another thing, because the only scales on the premise was 50 yards or more away, in another building. Gord was understandably very reluctant to attempt driving this monster through the ever-increasing crowd of people and many parked cars and trucks in the open yard. He was surprised as anyone when I volunteered to guide Rusty to the scales with just a corn broom. It was surely interesting to see the crowd scatter as we opened the pen door. Once outside, all those who saw what was coming gave us a wide berth all the way to the scales. Rusty behaved like a perfect gentleman as we walked, as we had many times before, without hesitations or interruptions. The scales proved Gord had guessed within 25 pounds, and there was lots of excitement as he collected his many bets. That 925-pound hog made more money for Gord in bets than in sales fees. As soon as the sows were sold, we changed the 4 farrowing pens into one large pen, and I proceeded to buy young pigs in greater numbers. The art of feeding our way had already been mastered, and our big problem now was the added risk of getting more disease in the barn as a direct result of the increased buying and the more crowded pens. Hog sales increased to an all-time high of 635 for my best year, and even though we fed straight skim milk, no water, for the heavy flow months of May and June, I still dumped several 500-gallon tanks into the orchard. George Hurst, manager of Stony Creek Dairy, was in a peculiar position of having no other outlet for skim, not even a sewer in which to dump it. So, in return for keeping the tank empty at the dairy, he allowed me to pay for the amount I considered I used economically. I paid my bill once in September and again in December, and it was always a fun day for both of us as we dickered back and forth to arrive at a figure. Dr. Roy Baldwin of Ancaster graduated from OAC at Guelph in 1950, and Ralph Knappman and myself were among his first clientele. Occasionally, one of my sows would have difficulty at farrowing time. Either she could not deliver the litter or would have no milk for them a couple of days later. The answer was a common drug known as pituitrin, to be injected into the vein of the ear, which would induce labor or milk, or both, instantly. Sows are notoriously irritable at this stage and reluctant to trust anyone, particularly strangers. On Roy's first visit for this problem, he was all set to follow the normal procedure of trying the sow with enough rope to immobilize her. It took a lot of talking and a guarantee to pay his doctor bills before he would consent to try the needle without the rope. Everything went fine, and for years afterwards, Roy assured me that mine was the only barn he would attempt such a procedure. Not long after the sows were gone and the barn was loaded to capacity, disease hit with a vengeance. 3 or 4 young pigs died for no apparent reason, and the sulfa Roy had supplied had little or no effect on the sick ones in the same pen. The next day, 3 more died, and I called Roy. The autopsy proved we had something different, and Roy was stumped. Everything he tried for the next few days had no better results, and he decided that I should take one of the dead ones to Guelph College for advice, a service OAC has always rendered to those farmers working through a vet. Guelph is about 35 miles away, and after the autopsy, I was advised that the pig I had brought was too long dead to allow a proper diagnosis. The next day, I returned with a live, sick pig. They asked dozens of questions in an attempt to form a case history, and everything went well until they learned I was not feeding the standard grain and concentrate diet, at which time all the enthusiastic cooperative efforts was completely dropped. I was informed that they would make a culture from the diseased pig, and from the culture a serum with which to inoculate all the pigs in the barn, a process that would take several weeks. The way the death rate was increasing, it would be quite possible that there would be no pigs left to get the serum by the time it was available. It looked to me like the end of the pig business, because we were now losing up to 10 a day, including pigs that weighed 160 pounds. Steve Piccone picked up the dead pigs every second day, and there seemed always to be a pile in front of the barn. Talk about being kicked when you're down. Some inconsiderate soul reported the situation to the health authorities, which was easily explained when I was investigated. I suppose it looked to him that the same dead pigs had stayed there day after day, which was certainly not so. Roy was here nearly every day, disgusted with Guelph and at his wits' end. As a last resort, he tried a drug called sodium arsenalate. For me, it was one of the miracle drugs. We fed it to the whole barn in the feed, a blue powder which dissolved easily in water and was not too critical for individual dosage, even though it contained arsenic. Inside of 3 days, the death rate dropped to half, and by the end of the week, to nil. The threat of that disease, whatever it was always present from that day forward, and if a pen started to show symptoms, a few days' treatment would clear it up without losing more than a day's weight gain. It was most fortunate for me that the 2 businesses, hogs and fruit growing, worked so well together. Inside the running of competition, they actually complemented each other. When dollars were short, it was most convenient to be able to run bills at the feed companies, while you waited for the fall payment of your total year's sales of fruit. And by the same token, use that money to pay in advance, usually $1,000, to have dehydrated alfalfa hay pellets stored by Papal Bros at Brantford for next year's feed requirements. The great amount of straw purchased for bedding increased by tenfold by the time it was spread on the orchards in the form of manure, the best possible source of humus and soil nutrients. Add to this the 40,000 gallons of liquid manure from the big cement tank that drained the hog pen floor, and it is easy to understand why fruit production increased so rapidly. On our way home from that cold island hunt camp at Whitney in 1954, I drove a considerable distance out of my way to visit Lloyd Stewart at Marmora. He was in a sad condition with cancer of the spine, and even if he could have survived, he would have been a hopeless drug addict. This was the last time I was to see him alive, as he was mercifully granted relief from suffering the following spring. His widow Merle was left with 2 boys, John being the eldest, and Kent still in public school, and with finances limited, it was a hard row to hoe. Merle and John moved to Hamilton to stay with her cousin Olga and Ed Wright, while Kent went to live with Lloyd's sister Evelyn and Arnold Smith in Ottawa. Neither of the boys were scholars, and by the time Kent was 17, they had quit school and were more or less at loose ends. Merle remarried to George Sharp, and they lived out on Toby Crescent in Hamilton. At the same time Flo was training at St. Catharines, Kent asked for a job on the farm. He started sometime in August and worked through to the following spring. He boarded with us from Monday to Friday, and we tried to make it as much like home as possible. Kent really appreciated our efforts, and he was soon one of the family and still is. When it came to September 15th, Lib's birthday, I had not remembered to get a present, not the first time by a lot. Kent and I were driving through Winona, having delivered some fruit to the shipping station, when the thought struck me. We went into the variety store there to get something. I found a card that said on the outside, "There is nothing too good for my wife on her birthday," and on the inside, "So that is what you're going to get." It seemed to fit the occasion, so I bought it. To my surprise, Kent was really shocked, and he made all kinds of suggestions that I should buy many different articles, either there or elsewhere. When all arguments failed, he bought a small box of chocolates from his own meager wages, which he hoped would soothe the insult of my card, and proudly presented it to Lib when we arrived home. There were many enjoyable happenings during his few months with us, such as the teasing and horseplay that Flo and her girlfriend, Carolyn DeMarsh, gave Kent when they would come home for an overnight or weekend visit, or the many ping-pong games at Hill's Garage on poor weather days where Kent was good enough at the game to take on all comers and generally win. And of course Norma thought he was the whole cheese. Van Haskett was our hired man at that time, a bit of a braggart and somewhat anxious to take advantage of a younger apprentice. Our normal procedure when loading pigs for weekly delivery was to first select those large enough from each pen, mark them with a paint, and proceed to get them all in the alley before starting to load them on the truck. The loading ramp was about 10 feet long and 2.5 feet wide and a little less than a 45-degree incline. The 1-inch high cleats on the ramp afforded good footing, but they were always reluctant to try anything the first time, so it took a good amount of persuasion. The electric stock prodder delivered a shock similar to that of a spark plug on a car, harmless but effective and certainly less brutal than hammering them with a board. It was about the size of a flashlight, and the batteries were the same size. So, by means of an old door, which was long enough to block off the alley, 2 men could start at the far end of the alley, move the door continually closer to the open door leading to the ramp, and leave them no choice but to climb. On Kent's first experience at this game, we had successfully loaded all but 3 of the 20 or more pigs. The leader, finding the truck rather crowded when he reached the top of the ramp, decided to turn and come back down. It was Kent's job to block off its exit, and when he saw it turn, he promptly squatted. Now, may I say, there is not a heck of a lot anyone can do with a determined 200-pound pig going downhill. The pig managed to get its head under Kent, and once off the ground, he made a record trip the full length of the ramp, feet first and arms flying in every direction. He just had no time to either get his feet on the ground or grab the sides of the ramp. Van was pretty quick to take full advantage of a funny situation, and as Kent was not hurt physically, he gave Kent a lot of criticism. To make a good story even better, Van volunteered to show Kent how it should be done. You guessed it. Either the same pig or another one put on a repeat performance with Van as a leading man. Kent didn't pull any punches, and the second trip was not nearly so funny from Van's viewpoint. However, it did serve to put them on a more even footing. End of chapter 15.